All right. Hi, everyone. I am so incredibly excited to be joined today by Doug Gordon. He is the co host of The War on Cars, he's the co author of Life After Cars. He's also a fellow Brooklynite. We found out that he lives on the street where I grew up on. And so very nice to have him kind of, just down the road from, where I am now in Brooklyn. Doug, it is fantastic to have you on the American Inequality Substack today.
It's great to be here. And I moved to the neighborhood in 2003, so I guess I'm like a first or second wave gentrifier. I don't know. You tell me to go back to where I come from, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You're, kind of well at home here. And so, Doug, I want to, dive in because you have done such fantastic work talking about the impact of, kind of cars on communities, how it very much so shapes our urban environment, how we believe that cars are this necessity of American life. In many ways, it is very much so baked into like American ideals, our narrative, our images of what we think about of the great open road. And I think you have and Sarah have done such fantastic work of like pushing back on that narrative, right? Why do we need to experience this reality? And I want to start off in this space of inequality that, kind of we often talk about here, which is like, how can we raise the stakes of some of these questions, right? And Doug, you have done such fascinating insights on where car deaths and gun deaths are somewhat connected in many of these ways, right? That we maybe take, car deaths, right, as a given, right? That is just a nature of the, kind of, Faustian bargain that we have made for, connecting cities and how big America is. Whereas guns, on the other side, we say we can get rid of this, right? And when you look at the numbers, right, you actually see that there's about 40,000, car deaths or so in the US every year, and a similar number of gun deaths. And for some reason, we say that one is okay, and the other one we very much so push back on. So how have you thought about like these two types of challenges, trade-offs, and sort of the similarities and differences that we have in this, kind of American narrative?
I mean, yeah, you're right. We talk in the book a little bit about what we call, my co-author, Sarah Goodyear, coined it the standard American unit of mortality, which is car deaths. And they are the metric by which other forms of death are often compared to. And that the idea is that car deaths, which are around 40,000 plus every year in the United States, are sort of like a fixed level. Like here's the red line. And then, opioid deaths are measured against that. Gun deaths are measured against that. And yes, like there's this idea that common sense gun reform, to use like the way that people talk about it, would be a way of lowering that. But we never really talk about like common sense car reform.
Right.
And, on a per 100,000 basis, per capita basis, the United States has something like 13 deaths per 100,000 Americans when it comes to automobile deaths. That's about twice any developed nation. In Europe, it's higher than Canada, which has a very similar built environment in terms of its cities versus its suburban and rural areas. So we are outliers, as we are in a lot of other ways. That's the bad form of American exceptionalism. And I think what we need to do in terms of like the idea of bringing it back to inequality is just start from a basic question, which is, why is the cost of full enfranchisement in your community, in your society, in your country, access to education, access to employment, access to social opportunities, seeing family, etc., just getting food? Why is the cost of that a $50,000 automobile? That's around the cost of a new car right now. Not to mention, whatever auto loan you take out, which is usually now around $700, $800 a month for some people. Insurance costs of $1,500 or more per year. It's going up and up for various reasons.
Yeah.
The vagaries of fuel pricing, gasoline prices go up and down depending on politics and world geopolitical situations. So that's the question I think I always want to start with. And then why is like this risk of death 1 in about 100? Why is that something we accept as just the cost of doing business? No other country like ours accepts this. And that's where I like to start from.
Yeah, I think this part of like this is the measure that we use, right? That this is like this, measure that all other measures are based on, right? Like have, opioid deaths surpassed, car deaths, have, loneliness deaths, have, vaping deaths surpassed car deaths. Like that is the thing that we kind of like, use as our make or break point. And I think you are very, kind of well established that like that doesn't need to be our break point, right? Like other countries have addressed it right, and we can kind of start doing some work to turn the tide on that. I know when you and I had last spoke, you sort of used this analogy too, which is like around how we often have this narrative of like children shouldn't die in schools, right? We should really do a lot of work to stop school shootings, right? But it's like, what about nobody should die, right? How can we also think about like pushing the envelope on some of these assumptions that we have about our communities? And so I think this part about like the not only financial costs of cars, but also these like life and death issues are so important.
Yeah.
I want to turn now to talk about like our reliance on cars and how it defines our urban life. So let's start with housing, because I think, many of us, right, have had this experience, right, that whether you've been to like New York City or Boston or San Francisco, like those areas are not the norm, right? You very much so will be car dependent and have to travel like long ways. Like, can you talk a bit about how cars have shaped our housing environment and maybe what they've contributed to like our rising housing costs?
Yeah, we had the late Donald Shoup on the podcast. He's an economist who specialized in parking policy. He was at UCLA for most of his career. And one of the things I took away from that interview was that like almost everything flows from parking requirements in buildings. Like if you're an architect and you want to design a building, an apartment building, let's say, or just a single family home, you sort of have to start with the parking. And in the urban housing realm, that comes from minimum parking requirements that many cities still have. And that basically says like if you're going to build a building with this much square feet, this many floors, this many units of housing, you have to provide X amount of parking per, let's say, per condo, per bedroom. And Shoup's point that he made very astutely in his sort of like very humorous way was that it's like voodoo science. There's no actual science behind how municipalities determine how much parking is necessary for that apartment building that's going up, or that strip mall that's being developed, or the new supermarket or big box store. And what that does, of course, then is like that increases the housing costs for everybody. It obviously fundamentally alters the design of these places because you have to build ground floor or underground parking or surface parking. But it also obviously increases the price of parking. We're all paying for it, whether we use that parking or not. The price of groceries goes up because of the massive parking lot that is real estate, that is taxed, that the corporation or the independent business has to pay, and then pass that on to all of us, whether we drive to the store and park there or not. So, it's like parking is this invisible force that shapes so much of our lives. It influences whether or not we even decide to walk or bike to the store. Because it's like you're saying, if you live in 98% of this country, what is between here and there is usually a lot of surface parking, entrances to parking lots, which makes the walking and cycling environment much worse. And then just sort of defaults you yourself, even if you have good intentions, to saying, it's only a mile and a half, but I'm going to drive there because the walk sucks. The bike ride is dangerous.
So I know, the war on cars has such a intense following, right? That people really, kind of love, the podcast. I think Donald Shoup, in some ways has this even more like, fanatic, following of people.
I don't think you can find an economist who has a following, even in death, like as intense as his. And, it's well earned. He was brilliant and funny and brought to light this, like I was saying, invisible force that determines so many parts of our lives. And his book, The High Cost of Free Parking, is somewhere behind me. It's a tome. It's big. Yeah. It's like everybody jokes about having read or not read The Power Broker, but I feel like sometimes the real test is, did you make it through the
Right, to
high
get to
cost
that
of free
next
parking?
level of
Yes, yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah, and I know Henry Graybar, kind of a friend of both of ours, had, kind of wrote that book on Paved Paradise, and was the one who actually
great.
introduced me to, Donald Shoup in this way. But yeah, I think this part of like, we maybe think about our house, right, as kind of just like this, white picket fence, also right in this American narrative way. But there's always that part on the side of like our parking, right? How much parking needs to be set up for all these large condos as well, and that can really diminish our ability to like increase supply. So
Yeah,
this, I think, other invisible force of housing that you were alluding to as well is, right, the zoning component, right? That we have all of these zoning rules that require so much of this, mandatory parking minimums for so many of these units. Have there been places where you have seen like they have done a nice job of limiting, right, or changing those zoning rules to either get rid of those parking requirements, right, remove them, or think about this right balance, right, where in some areas like you are car dependent, right? But I think in New York City or a lot of urban areas, we tend to like see these divides on some of these debates about parking minimum of like a rich versus poor debate, right? Like wealthier families that tend to have cars or maybe car dependent live in suburbs or kind of or ex-urban areas that want that, versus the lower income families that are heavily reliant, right, on public transit. The Bronx is such a fascinating example of this, where 60% of people in the Bronx do not have a car, but there are parts of the Bronx, wealthier areas like Riverdale, where is still part of the Bronx, but you have many families that live in these beautiful detached homes. And so can you talk a bit about the like invisible forces of zoning in this and areas that you have seen that have figured out how to do this balance well?
yeah. We talked on the podcast with Sarah Bronin, who wrote an article. Sorry, she wrote a book about zoning, and I think much like with Henry's book, it's like, oh, a book about parking, that's got to be the most boring thing in the world. But Henry was able to write it in such a way that's just fascinating. Same thing with Sarah's book, and she talks a little bit about Hartford, Connecticut, which was kind of destroyed by parking and parking requirements in many ways, and its downtown very famously, it's just like a lot of surface parking lots. And they've slowly been able to claw that back. There's a nationwide organization called the Parking Reform Network. Donald Shoup was an advisor to them. And they've very successfully advocated and helped local communities advocate for the abolition of parking requirements in many cities. And, I think it's like Baltimore, Portland, Oregon, small cities, San Francisco, not the smallest of cities, of course, but that have eliminated or reduced parking minimums. Even here in New York, the City of Yes program under Eric Adams, there was talk of, eliminating or reducing parking requirements within certain distances of transit stops, subway stops, bus stops, things like that. Yeah, I think zoning really is, it's like, how far apart things are dictates how we move and what it's like to move through those places. And I think we know this intuitively, of course. So yeah, I would encourage people to check out the Parking Reform Network. They have a great map of all the cities that have reduced or eliminated parking minimum requirements. And I think the really important thing to say about parking minimum requirements and the elimination of them is that usually it doesn't mean that buildings and developers no longer have to include parking.
Mm.
They're not saying you may not include parking. What they're saying is let the market decide. If a developer wants to include parking because it pencils out for them and that's what they think their buyers are going to want, then they can do it. But they're not required by law to do it. It's this weird thing where we progressives are advocating for market-based solutions to what we see as a social problem, as a design problem. And the capitalists, actually, the right, are saying, no, we want socialism. We want the government to mandate like how, where, and what type of development you can build. But yeah, I highly recommend people check out the Parking Reform Network, because that will sort of demystify this whole idea for a lot of folks.
Yeah, that is so fascinating, like this flip kind of in right perspective on this, right? Where you actually, and much of this is like in the, Ezra Klein abundance world, which is like, how can we reduce some of these like unnecessary regulations to increase supply? And that you have a lot of the folks on the left who are like, this free market approach might actually very much so help with some of this, but we are like tethered to the past. And I think, some of this is also just like updating with the times, right? That we have gotten, cities have built so many more, bike lanes, right? We are very much so improving public transportation in a lot of places. And so how can we like, continue to move in that direction? And yeah, like untether from these things, and you end up having these really negative outcomes. And we love a great map. So excited to hear that there's, some great map stuff. But
Yeah,
like,
definitely. Parking Reform Network.
you'll
They do
have
great.
these like giant,
Tony
like,
Jordan, who runs the Parking Reform Network, is like just doing the tough work of rallying people around the country and bringing attention, like I said, to this thing that most people don't even see as this determinative force in how their cities are built.
let's talk about another invisible force in cars that people probably think a little bit more about than just kind of like zoning and parking, which is pollution and the impact that that has on certain communities, cities, and even just the way that we like frame some of these issues. Right, we're going to talk about congestion pricing in New York City a little later on, and in some other cities across the US, but in Europe, in London, for example, like they sometimes refer to their congestion zones as these like low pollution zones instead. So talk to us about like how we've been framing this like pollution kind of car debate and as like in this invisible force that impacts communities, and also like what we're seeing as some of these like prolonged health impacts.
Yeah, I mean, so London's a good example because they have kind of two separate zones. One is the congestion zone, which came first in 2003, and then they have the ULEZ, or ultra low emission zones, where if you have certain models of cars from certain years, you pay a fine or a fee to access those areas. And that has encouraged then, of course, people to switch to higher efficiency vehicles, electric vehicles, things like that. Yeah, it's, pollution. I think like, there's this idea that the switch to electric cars, for example, will just solve emissions. And that is true to an extent if you're just talking about tailpipe emissions. But, PM2 is a huge piece of the pollution. And that's literally the pieces of your car that are shredded, tire wear, brake wear, things like that, that actually get worse the heavier a car is, of course. And electric vehicles are often heavier than their gas counterparts because the batteries are so big.
Right.
And that, that can lead to more wear and tear on the roads. That can lead to greater tire wear, things like that. That's all stuff we're breathing in. I think, anyone who's in the Northeast right now, especially in New York, can go outside and see how lovely the snow was for a day or two, and then how quickly it turns black. Or if you ever clean your windowsill in the spring, let's say, and you see the black soot, that's all, not all, but a lot of that is from cars. And you're breathing that in. What doesn't land on your windowsill or on the snowbank goes into your nostrils and your mouth and goes into your lungs and into your bloodstream. And so I think we sort of know, and then we think about where lower income people tend to live. It's along busy arterials. Even the cities that are building a lot of housing, the zoning is such that you can only build the multifamily, multi-story housing along busy arterials. Even here in New York, where, I live just steps from 4th Avenue in Brooklyn, we've got tons of apartments going up. But that's one of the busiest streets in my district. And so the people who live there are more exposed to high pollution rates. In the Park Slope Historic District, where you have a lot of brownstones, maybe they used to be multifamily, they're converted to one families. Those people are breathing cleaner air because there's less traffic and less pollution as a result. So that, that's part of the inequality thing. We need to rethink zoning so that breathing clean air is not a luxury item. It's not a exclusive product that you can only get if you can afford a single family home in a lower traffic part of your city or town.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Weird just happened for a second. Yeah, that I think this part of like, who has to be the, kind of victim of, these high pollution areas as a result of cars is, something that we have been seeing go on for, decades now, right? Black communities, Hispanic communities are disproportionately like placed next to these, mega highways, right? Again, just talking about the power broker, right? So many of these communities, right, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn's, in Queens, were, sliced up, placed next to giant highways, many of them, low income areas. And that injustice, right, is something that we often, put as like, out of sight, out of mind, right, for many of these, higher income areas. And then I think when you try to escape it, you sometimes create some of these, perverse issues in cities as well, right? So you look at Atlanta that has like just created this massive sprawl as people try to escape, some of these higher polluted areas. You then, right, become even more reliant on cars because you kind of create this like, negative cycle where you try and escape the pollution, you move further out, you need more mega highways, you need more cars to kind of, create this setup. And the people who end up bearing the costs, tend to be low income communities. But this point that you mentioned too, which is like, what is our experience of living in cities? And in speaking, with friends who are, doctors and have spent time, kind of like doing surgeries, they talk about the difference between like people who live in cities and those who don't when they look at their lungs, right? Many of them, can appear as though they have been like, lifelong cigarette smokers because of the like, soot that basically accumulates in their lungs over their lifetime. Yeah, I see one person
Yeah.
in the, chat talking about like trains and Amtrak. Like, yes, maybe, we could rely more on like, and subways are really effective in a lot of our cities, but right, Amtrak is, painfully slow. Our train infrastructure is like very much so outdated. And I think part of this is like where we're actually choosing to invest our time and resources. So often it goes to just expanding our highways, right? We talk about congestion and where we live, and we just like go from a 10 lane to a 12 lane highway instead of like figuring out how to connect our
And it doesn't work.
areas.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I think the Bronx is a great example because the people who live there experience some of the highest asthma rates in the nation. And we'll get to congestion pricing, I know, but, there was a legitimate concern among many of the people who live there and their representatives that congestion pricing would push truck traffic and automobile traffic even more to the outer boroughs and create even higher rates of asthma. That didn't pan out in the way that people thought, and that's good. But I think a lot of people who live in Westchester, let's say, they only think of the Bronx as they're driving through it on their way to Manhattan, right, to theater, to work, whatever it is. And they're not really thinking of all of those negative externalities that happen, like who is bearing the brunt of their choice to live in Westchester, Scarsdale, wherever it is, and then drive through to access
Yeah.
opportunity in the city and then drive back to their home.
Do you believe that electric vehicles and driverless cars are going to like solve these issues? Like can we just imagine a world where like our cyber cab just drops us off and then like goes far away and it's electric and it's emission, free, and it just charges like in some, depot far away, and we don't have to worry about parking like that? You know, it's maybe not as sci-fi a world as we maybe, thought. Like, what's
Yeah,
your,
I mean,
what's your view on?
the party line from the podcast on electric vehicles is basically in cities with good public transportation and good bones, places like New York, Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, even the downtowns of other places like Cincinnati and whatever, places that had robust transit infrastructure in the past, even Los Angeles to a certain extent. Those places, we should make it possible to live as car free as possible, electric or otherwise. You should not need a car if you live in those places. We should double down on public transportation, on trains, on bike lanes, on walkability. In rural areas, suburban areas where there right now is no alternative but to drive, yes, electrify every last vehicle. In cities where vehicles are necessary, service vehicles, delivery vehicles, emergency vehicles, we should be electrifying that stuff as quickly as possible. However, that being said, big preamble, cars are not a technology problem. They are a geometry problem. If you switched every last vehicle in New York City, in San Francisco, wherever, to electric, that would be good. It would be quieter. There'd be less exhaust, but it wouldn't solve traffic. As a cyclist, if I'm hit by one, I write in the book, nobody who's ever hit by a car thinks, "Oh, thank God it was electric. My death was good for the environment."
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, cars are a geometry problem. There is no place on earth that we like to visit. We talk about this sort of revealed preference that we have when we go on vacation, that we think, oh, this would be improved if there were more electric vehicles, more autonomous vehicles. We actually walking around the banks of the Seine River or Disneyland or a beach resort or, the Jersey Shore is nice because there aren't a lot of, you can leave the car somewhere else. So you have to be careful what you wish for with electric vehicles. Like, they have their place. They are one piece of the solution, but they are not ultimately the best solution overall, I think. And I'm not even getting to the like AV part of it all.
Yeah. And I think this part, right, which kind of connects to like what risks are we facing as a society with cars, right? Like, yes, they might help us get rid of, pollution, but it still poses like a risk to our cities. And I think particularly in this time where we are so worried about, job generation and, cities being such a center of like where jobs are, that the more we require space for cars and highways, the like less, possible it is for people to live in these cities where a lot of these, jobs are still, kind of being generated.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big theme for us, and I'm stealing this line from Jason Slaughter of Not Just Bikes, but his line is basically, the only solution to traffic is to give people viable alternatives to driving. That's it. Nothing else will work. Congestion pricing has sped up, decreased traffic and sped up the traffic that remains. Tolling in general and pricing does have its place, of course, but you then have to give people the alternatives they need to seek something else other than a car. And that's the only, building more traffic lanes, induced demand is a real phenomenon, and it just doesn't work. The United States ultimately is one big experiment in induced demand. We keep adding lanes to traffic, and it doesn't solve it one bit.
Yeah. And I think this, point that there is a universe, right, where we could create cities that don't rely on cars, like that is not, such a far-fetched reality, right? And I know you touch on this, in the book, Life After Cars, where like it can be possible even for people in, certain parts of cities that sometimes feel like they're really disconnected, right, from the giant web of public transit, that there are ways to, bring them to, central hubs via buses or bikes or shuttles or
I was about to say, like, the bus. We have lately, I think, on the podcast been talking about the bus so much because obviously Mayor Mamdani made it a central plank in his campaign to make buses fast and free. I like to really focus on the fast part of that, actually, because I think that is a much more achievable thing that a mayor can do. Making them free requires so much collaboration and negotiation with Albany that may or may not yield success, but making them faster is absolutely 100% in his control. He controls the streets. And buses are a low cost, high reward solution to traffic.
So let's talk about buses then for a second, and I'm going to make you talk about the part that you said you don't want to talk about because you said that, which is the free part. So there was this report, I know, came out maybe a month ago or so about BART in San Francisco, kind of the public transit system out there, and about how increasing friction, basically, whether through fare hikes or ways to stop people from jumping turnstiles, right? They kind of created this new big turnstile infrastructure, actually decreased crimes. I think it was something like 41%, and also raised revenues for BART, I think somewhere in the order of, 10 or 11 million. And the one narrative that I was very much so seeing about this was that increasing friction can actually be good for some public transit systems, right? You basically keep out, fare evaders or people who would be causing crime. I'm not really sure how I feel about that narrative, but there was a lot of, as many people love to do, talk about like New York versus San Francisco comparisons, right? And were there lessons for New York City and Mayor Mamdani to learn about this area where he is focused on decreasing friction, right, through making buses free, and what that might mean for the bus system?
Yeah, it's a really complicated topic. We had Yona Freemark, who's a researcher, does a lot of research into transportation and housing, on the show to talk about the pros and cons of making buses free. Fare evasion became a kind of a side conversation there. And yeah, it gets tricky because then you are talking about like who are you keeping out of the system? Um, you know, just magically enforcing fare evasion doesn't solve homelessness. It just pushes homeless people, unhoused people to other parts of your city that may or may not be good for them or anyone really. Um, where I come down on free fares is that, look, if you survey bus riders and transit users in general about what they want, what they need, what's preventing them from relying on transit more, the cost is actually not usually in the top 4 or 5 reasons. It's things like the bus doesn't come frequently enough. It doesn't go where I want it to go. Maybe it doesn't operate depending on the city that you're living in the hours I need it to operate. It doesn't feel safe for me. Let's say I'm a woman traveling alone at night. Things like that. Cost fares usually do not top the conversation. That doesn't mean we shouldn't think about making them free. We have lots of free things that benefit people in this city and elsewhere, libraries and parks and things like that. And I think there was a really good conversation to be had about like, should transit be free? I'm a little skeptical. The best transit systems in the world tend not to be free. The ones that we hold up as the examples, Japan, Germany, Europe in general, they tend not to be free. There are exceptions here and there. So I think we have to talk a lot about making it fast and reliable first. Making it free can make it faster because there's so many reports about fare box collection. We've all been on the bus and have experienced, the line of people waiting to pay and gosh, can we just get these people on the bus so it can go sort of feeling. So anecdotally, I think we all intuitively, let's say, understand that. But then it becomes a question of like, New York City fare box collection is a significant portion of operating revenues, like what's replaced with that? Again, I think if you're on the left, farther left than me, the answer is higher taxes on rich people, like just like we use them to pay for education, public schools, like other things that we agree as a society should be free because they're in the public good. But I just don't know where I come down. Like I think like like I said, there's a lot that Mayor Mamdani can do right now to make the buses faster, get the cars out of the way, give us protected, separated bus lanes, signal priority where a bus reaches a red light and the light turns green just for that bus while the drivers are held back. There's a lot that the mayor could do to make the buses more efficient.
Yeah, and I think this point about where are our priorities on this, right? What do we decide to invest in or not? Like, why do we, prevent, buses from operating in these certain ways, right? You see more and more cities creating these dedicated, bus lanes, which sometimes get a lot of, pushback on this. But we decide, over and over again to allow cars to dominate our cities, and very much so, prioritize like the few car owners over the many, public transit riders. And that creates all of these, negative downstream effects like pollution and traffic and, traffic deaths. And
I will say, like, something we really try to hammer home, however, is like we can discuss the details of this, the pros and cons, and many people have and will. I think the really great thing about the conversation around free bus fare is that for the first time in my living memory, and probably yours, which is remarkable, we had a mayor, a candidate for the highest office in our city, talking about bus riders as a constituency that deserved something good. And it's remarkable that that has
That's
not
true.
happened in mayoral campaigns in New York City, of all places, where bus riders are a significant portion of transit riders. They are often the lowest income. They often, are older, have more disabilities, even than subway riders. Um, and so I think like the fact that we are just here all talking about bus riders as a constituency worthy of, my co-host Sarah will talk about this: dignity, respect, good service, safety. That's really important. And that we're talking about the bus as a solution that can improve people's lives, getting them to work, getting them more opportunities, like I said before, social opportunities, educational opportunities, access to food, good jobs. That to me, regardless of what the outcome is over the free bus thing, of whether he succeeds and gets everything he ever wanted, or we have to compromise and just get like 10 free bus lines, either way, it's a win. And I think we need more Democrats talking about the people who are not often talked about or centered in our conversations about politics.
You're 100% right, and in many ways, it's been an easier kind of persona to talk about because I feel like the bicyclist versus car like is this like eternal battle of the streets, and they're like we have these very certain images of the two, but the bus rider somehow feels like they're in this kind of other area of public transit.
Oh,
This
I
is
mean,
really
and talk about inequality. You basically have, bus riders that can fit 40 or 50 people, let's say, or more, often have to wait in traffic behind one person in a Lexus, or a Range Rover
yeah.
parking their car, or waiting to turn left or whatever it is. And like, there's nothing more inequitable than that on our
Yeah.
street.
That's very true, and it very much so like physical embodiment of right that injustice. There was this part of the book that I, loved where friction was really impactful for improving,
Mhm.
this one, community in Ghent. So can you talk a bit about like
Yeah.
what Ghent did that increased friction and actually created this kind of really positive outcome for this community?
Yeah.
Because I think it's one of these nice examples of like, here's a very specific kind of flip that you can do, which really, doesn't feel like it's maybe that much effort that creates all these really positive, downstream.
Yeah, Ghent is really cool. So it's a small Belgian city, about 240,000 people. It's a university town, lots of students. And it had, after World War II, like a lot of European cities, it had experimented with car-centric design, infrastructure. It allowed cars to park everywhere. Slowly but surely over the 90s, they pedestrianized the very core historic center of the city. And that seemed to work pretty well. There were people who were against it. It was controversial at the time, but over time it really worked. Flash forward to the 2000s, 2010s, and traffic becomes a much bigger issue as the city is growing and thriving. And the minister of mobility, this man named Philippe Watteau, um, who's sort of like the transportation department director for the city, said, it's traffic's just getting untenable. It's creating all sorts of problems: noise, pollution, traffic, of course, congestion, safety issues for pedestrians and cyclists, transit access is being impeded. What can we do? And they found that a lot of the traffic in the city was just cutting through the city, using it as a shortcut to get from point A to point B. And it didn't, basically what they found was like these were not people who lived in the city, people who were doing business in the city, shopping, visiting doctors or anything like that. They were just traveling through. And so what they did was they basically divided the city into 6 zones and said, number one, if you're driving from outside the city into it, you're going to probably have to pay. So there are cameras, much like congestion pricing. And what we would like you to do instead is stick to the ring road. They have this ring road that circles the city, and that's what you have to do if you want to get from here, from
Yeah,
here to there. You have to go
over the
around.
top.
Even if you live in the city and you want to get from, let's say, zone 1 to zone 5, you have to go out, around, and back in instead of just going. You could literally be like on one side of the zone versus the other, and what was, let's say, maybe a 10-minute drive becomes a 20 or 30-minute drive. But you now look at Google Maps and you say, but taking the bus or light rail or biking or walking, becomes much faster and more efficient. I think we've all done that thing of like, especially if you're in New York, of like looking at Google Maps and saying, it says it's going to take 38 minutes by subway, 25 minutes by car, 26 minutes by bike. And so, I'm going to drive or whatever. I'm going to make a different choice. They made driving the most friction filled choice that you can make in terms of time and price. And what that did, they instituted this after many years of planning in 2017. Nitrous oxide levels went way down. Traffic in the city center went way down. The amount of cycling, they had like a goal that they were hoping to reach by 2030. They reached it within 2 or 3 years of 2017.
Wow.
Transit speeds increased, and just the amount of activity in the downtown, in the central city core, really went up. The really, really cool thing, if you live in a car-centric part of the world or the country, or you depend on your car in New York, let's say, is that one of the biggest beneficiaries of this program has been people who live in the city who need to drive. Because now, if you're trying to access your home, let's say you've gone away for the weekend and are coming back, you're not stuck in traffic behind people who are just cutting through the city because it's shorter. Or you're not stuck in traffic behind the person who is dropping their kids off at school and it's only a mile, a kilometer or two away. They're biking now, or they're walking now. And so drivers, even though they have to go farther distances to reach their destinations within the city, are often finding a much more pleasant experience. And it's been a win-win-win all around for everybody. But, except for the people who are just using the city to cut through it.
Yeah, that's
and that can be applied at scale here in New York. You could take a neighborhood like Park Slope or Dumbo or the West Village or Harlem or whatever, and say, we're just going to make it harder for people to use this neighborhood as a cut through. We're going to reverse the direction of some streets, which is what they did in Ghent. We're going to cut some streets off entirely to through traffic. We're going to make some streets bike priority, where you cannot pass a cyclist, and speed limits are kept to 12 or 15 miles an hour. These are all things. I think it cost Ghent 5.8 million euros to implement this entire program. And it has, of course, yielded much more in terms of financial benefits, health savings, things like that, boost to the economy. It's great.
So you've alluded to it a little bit already. Are there parts where you see very, similarities between like congestion pricing in New York City and this? It feels like Ghent kind of did congestion pricing like on steroids. They kind of like went much further with it, right? They, implemented the, kind of cameras to, kind of track people's, speed or where they were going, and charge them accordingly. But even these small things of just, they like flipped street signs, right? To say like, you can no longer go this way, you can only, kind of go that way. And the impact that it had on, people's well-being, not only from a traffic perspective, but also like your home area just becomes nicer, like feels like something that people, drivers often think about the negative impacts of these types of things, but there's like this broader, I think, aura of change that is underappreciated.
Yeah, I mean, I think just with congestion pricing, the fact that there's pricing, we as transit users, we think about the price of our fare every time we go out. We think, it's 6 blocks away. Should I spend the $3 to get on the bus? Yes, no, it's raining. Like, we make all of these decisions. There's like a set of heuristics that we have, right? Of like whether or not we're going to swipe that fare card or tap our phone or whatever. Drivers tend to not have to think about that, or historically have not in New York. Maybe they've had to think about, will parking be available on the other side of my trip? Will it be free? Am I willing to circle the block for however long looking for free parking? Am I going to give up, put it in the garage, whatever? Congestion pricing just introduced friction into the decision-making process. You think, I could drive into the city for $9, or let's just take the subway. It'll be $6 between the two of us, right? It's just too expensive every day to pay that price. So it's a great thing that I think now what we need the mayor to do is sort of cash in on the spatial dividend that's been left behind by congestion pricing, and say, okay, we have fewer cars on the street. That means there's more space. That means we could put in more bus lanes. We could put in more bike lanes, more pedestrian plazas to make Midtown, let's say, more pleasant to be in. And so, yeah, I think that the friction is such an important thing. It influences every piece of our behavior, and it doesn't often influence driving because it's just the default in so much of the country.
Right. And I think, probably one of the main differences also between New York City and Ghent is like this alternative transit system, right? That, very much so, right, exists, or, the scale of it. And I think in New York City, there was this narrative, as there is, kind of for many of these areas before congestion pricing, that it is going to negatively or disproportionately impact, low income residents, right? That this fare on them, right, is such a larger share of their income, and it is a total injustice, and that we can't layer this on them. But the reality is that so many more of these low income residents are relying on public transit anyways, right? And yes, some of them, I think the estimates were like 2 to 4% of low income outer borough residents were likely to face an impact from this, but so much more of it is exurban, suburban areas, people coming in from New Jersey and Connecticut, who will be, kind of like paying those, higher prices. But the flow through of money that can then go towards building out, all of this, yeah, the spatial dividend, as you said, on, buses and bike lanes and improved public transit, like that's where you actually see this kind of increased benefit to so many
Yeah.
more people that can come out of it.
Yeah, it's funny. I sometimes compare drivers in New York City to like the way that elected officials in New York City treat drivers is often the way Republicans treat coal miners, of like they are the only authentic American, right? Coal miners. But there's this like invisible underclass of like service workers, right? Who really actually make up the working class in this country. And the reason we don't, or our elected officials don't see them, is because they aren't like white men in traditional roles in this country. And I think that that's true of bus riders compared to drivers. Like, first of all, drivers just speak up more. Take away a parking spot from a driver, and they're going to call the mayor, their city council member. Whereas a bus rider, if they're stuck in traffic because of someone, traffic in front of them, like they don't necessarily have the time, the resources to, that maybe they're working two jobs, late getting home from a shift, a wage earning job. There's that. So again, going back to Mamdani, I'm glad he's listening to those people. But yeah, like the number of low income people who rely on transit and who enter Manhattan via public transportation far outnumbers the amount of drivers who are low income. And what I like to say, all policy has winners and losers. The goal of good policy, right, is to maximize the number of winners, minimize the number of losers, and think about repair for the losers. And I think what congestion pricing does so well is, number one, if you are a low income driver and you are in that very small number of people who are low income and need your car for work, and you live in Manhattan or drive to it for work, there are tax credits, right? So you can get back some
Yeah.
of that money that you're going to pay. And that's about as good as you can get, I think. There might be, other ways, immediate rebates, things like that. You don't want to delve too far into means testing, for example. But I think congestion pricing is as big a win-win, like most number of winners, least number of losers. And like then the benefits to bus riders is just huge. Like buses showing up early to stops and then having to dwell at the stop longer so they can stay on the right schedule. That's an incredible improvement.
Yeah.
The
And
health
one,
savings.
other part that you had mentioned with the, Ghent example is like this ability as well to like monitor who is coming in and out, even knowing, right, who these riders are that they're actually just transiting through. And this part of advocacy, like knowing who your constituents are, what they care about. Just because you aren't getting that angry email or phone call from somebody who's stuck on a bus doesn't mean that they don't exist. And so I think this also, we've been talking a lot about like the inequality of this, but another component of it is like the data on these issues, right? Well,
Yeah.
you have written pieces on like transportation and inequality, right? In the upcoming book, I talk a lot about, these communities that are disproportionately struggling with long, commute times and what that does to employment and homelessness and evictions and injustice. But if we don't have good data on these types of things, it makes it really difficult for policymakers to put time and money and energy behind these challenges, and we don't often have that.
Yeah, unfortunately, what we do have is a lot of anecdata. Basically, we have the business owner who says, my customers arrive by car. And how does that business owner measure that? Well, by the number of people who complain to him. And
Yeah.
probably what happens is that if you drive to a diner or a hardware store and you can't find parking, the first thing you say when you walk in, when you're late to your
Right.
reservation or whatever, is you say, "Oh, I would have been here earlier, but parking, it's so hard to find parking," or "The traffic was terrible." Meanwhile, if you bike or take transit or walk, you just kind of walk in like, "Hi, I'm here, table for two." Or, you pick up your whatever you purchase at the hardware store and you say thank you and you walk out. And they never hear the cyclist say, "Oh, I wish it was a safer, easier place to bike to," or, there was no place to lock up my bike outside, or, the bus was delayed. Like they don't say that, but drivers complain.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that information is so important.
I think another anecdote that we I've been encountering a lot, not only with just, in people talking about like what is this economy like, but even in transportation conversations, is that like previous generations had it a lot better. And I'm embarrassed to say that I just finished watching the last season of Stranger Things this past week. Embarrassed because this last season wasn't that good. And also because I'm so late on it, the phenomenon as well, I think. But I'm so struck every single time I see it by like these children who, like bike up and then just like throw their bikes in the front yard. And right, Stranger Things is I think in the 80s. And I think many people like grew up in this universe of like biking around was easier, throwing the bike in the front yard, like that's, kind of trope that we see in media, right?
Yeah.
Very much so, comes from somewhere. As someone like who grew up in Brooklyn, we didn't have front yards to throw our bikes in, though I did do much, biking growing up. Like, is it worse today than it was back then? Like, is that just an anecdote that we hear and like to see in media, or is that a verifiable thing that you kind of think?
Yeah, we cite a stat in the book that in the late 1960s, about 40% of American kids biked or walked to school. Now it's down to less than 11%.
Wait, sorry,
Um,
40% to 11%?
yeah,
Wow,
yeah, from about 1969 to today.
that's crazy.
Yeah, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of them are related to design of our communities. We have more, let's say, like sprawl, exurban type developments that are built maybe without sidewalks, cul-de-sacs that just empty out onto busy arterial stroads where it just is impossible to bike safely, and no sane parent would let their kid do it. Um, I think there's probably an element of like helicopter parenting that comes in, which sometimes gets a bad rap. But I think in terms of traffic safety, like you're not a helicopter parent if you're like, "I don't want you biking to school because that road is so dangerous and we know 3 people who've been hit there." That's legit. The size of vehicles has gone up, right? I think in our lifetime, just in the last 20, 30 years, the rise of SUVs. I mean, try getting a small sedan right now. You almost can't. The American automakers don't make them. They make SUVs. So there's that. And so, yeah, this is measurable. There's also statistics on the number of kids who live within like 1.5 miles of their school
Mm,
who bike or walk. That number has gone down. And
why is
it
that?
isn't, well, that's a really interesting thing, because if you think about like we live in the cities where kids can walk and bike easily to or take transit to school. In traditional city building or town building, the town I grew up in actually in kind of rural suburban Massachusetts, my middle school was located in the town center. Right, it was like City Hall and the middle school were right next to each other, one block off of Main Street, where most of the grocery store, the pharmacy, the hardware store, the bookstore, the library, all of that was there, and you could walk to it. Today, in
Sounds
a
a
lot
lot
of
like Stranger Things, to be honest. And so,
yes, yeah, yeah, I didn't chase aliens or anything like that or monsters
yeah.
in my childhood, but now a lot of the development that's being built is schools, new schools are being built in greenfield development far on the edge of town where land is cheap and it's just sprawled out. So there might be a housing development right across the street or within a half mile of that school. But if what's between the school
Mm,
and home or home and school is a busy 6-lane road, you're not going to walk or bike or let your kid do that. So that's really what's changed. There's nothing's changed about kids
fascinating.
in
Right.
the last 30, 40 years. What's changed is how we've built the world around them.
Yeah, that is, yeah, very interesting to hear that, we've seen not this massive shift. And yeah, even that when schools are close, in some ways it reminds me of like, the narrative around food deserts in some ways too, right? That if you live in, kind of one of these low income areas that then gets like a Whole Foods, it's effectively out of reach because the prices are so high, like you can't afford the $7 avocado. And so it's like
Right,
the
right.
school might be close, the places you're trying to go to are close, but if we create no safe, reliable way to, traverse that, giant highway or get to that, area, it's also effectively out of reach. And there's such, to your point about like how we are creating cars, there's these amazing, charts, that I'll share around when I, kind of publish this, recording afterwards on like, and they do these really great visualizations that show like a little kid on a bicycle or just a little kid standing there and like how difficult it is for a driver and a Ford F-150 to like see over the hood of the car and like how that has changed over time,
Yeah,
because we are creating technology, cars, infrastructure that is not cognizant of, like our lived environment of certain communities of children. Like we continue to really embed this, driver
yeah.
mentality, and it really leaves scars on communities. Us up. But it was so fantastic to have Doug in the call today. I am dropping his book, Life After Cars, in the chat, and I will be sure to share it out on the recording of this as well. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining, and looking forward to chatting with more of you soon.